Irv looked back and forth between Ernie and the girl, and clarity dawned.
Good God Almighty. It's like that, is it?
Ernie grinned. Rather stupidly, Irv thought. She and me have took up.
Hell, Ernie, you're old enough to be her uncle. We figured it out. Have you figured out how you're going to support her? She won't cost much. She don't take up hardly any room. She's little, but carries her weight, like an ant.
He grabbed the jar of whiskey away from Irv, took a swig, and, keeping his eyes forward, said, I know what's got your dander up. You're thinking, how can I like her after she's been a whore?
I don't judge the girl for that. You ought to know me better, Ernie. I just didn't see this coming. Took me by surprise is all.
You and me both, Ernie said, smiling in that stupid way again. Me, looking how I do, I never counted on having a woman. But Corinne said she's no raving beauty either. She looks fine to me, though. Appearances don't matter. Irv shook his head and chuckled.
No, I guess they don't, or my Dorothy would never have taken to me.
Beans are ready, Corinne called from across the clearing. Are y'all gonna come eat, or continue to talk about me like I ain't here? After gathering around the fire and filling their tin plates, Corinne said, I got an opinion on whether or not we do a run. Snootily, she added, if anybody's interested.
Let's hear it,
Irv said. How do you spell imprudent? She asked Ernie. As an aside to Irv, he said, I'm helping her with her letters. Then to Corinne, EMPROODUNT. I think it means... I figured out what it means, she said. And I think if your granddaddy was here, he'd say his neck was itching something fierce and we should lay low. She tilted her head back and looked at the sky. It was so hot today, the sky was almost white, hardly any blue. When it's this hot, people turn cranky, tempers get short. Things that have been simmering tend to boil over. If we don't cook tonight, Laura will be disappointed we didn't make product. But if we got killed, she'd keel over herself. She's had enough people die on her. I don't want that lady to have more grief on account of me. That's my say. Irv, Ernie said, you get the last word. He pondered it, then said,
I expect you're right, Corinne. After supper, let's move to where we hid out last night. We'll be locked and loaded, prepared to defend ourselves, but let's hope we won't have to.
He gazed off into the distance in the direction of town.
But I'm scared that no matter what we do, Laurel is going to come to grief.
Jesus, Mary and Joseph. Mike O'Connor's blasphemy echoed off the limestone wall of the cellar. They came down here? They invited themselves, Laurel said. There was no graceful way to refuse. If we hadn't installed those false shelves, they would have caught me red-handed. All those evenings I spent stewing fruit and berries saved us. It also had helped to have a father-in-law to whom nailing scrap lumber together to form shelving had been the work of only a few hours. The exertion had pained his wounded arm for days after, but he would be glad to hear that his effort had prevented a catastrophe.
The mayor likes to push his weight around, Davy said. He's a blowhard.
Don't underestimate how sinister he is under all that bluster, Laurel said. He frightened me, and so did Landry. At least with Croft you know where you stand. Landry lurked and listened, all the while smiling like a snake oil salesman. Mike said, Yeah, he's a sneaky one. How do you know Chester Landry? We don't, Mike said, but we've seen him around, usually at Lefty's. I know the smile you're talking about, like he knows you're the one who farted. Laurel said, Thatcher warned me of him. When was this? Oh, it's Thatcher now. Davy spoke over his brother, but Laurel addressed Mike's question. That was Thatcher's purpose for coming here the night you saw him in the yard. He cautioned me about Landry. I didn't take him seriously. I should have. Croft made it clear that he and Landry are committed to squashing the Johnsons. Do they realize how many Johnsons there are? Davy asked. They're like cockroaches. Musing aloud, Laurel said, I wouldn't be surprised if Crofts and Landry's operation isn't just as large. They're more discreet, but ambitious, and every bit as ruthless as any Johnson. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that they initiated all the trouble last night.
Exactly what did Mr. Croft propose?
The upshot was that he and Landry have a pool of moonshiners producing for them, and they want me to become one of them. An or else was implied.
You're not thinking of joining them?
Absolutely not. I haven't worked this hard to pay middlemen 10%. I suppose we should be flattered that they considered us enough of a threat to bother. Croft even admitted how good our liquor is and how well it sells.
What happened after your grandstanding?
They complimented me on the pie business's expansion and left.
Mike frowned. I don't like it. These men aren't fools, Laurel. They were too dignified to go tearing down shelving looking for your stockpile of shine. They backed off, but they're drawing up another plan of attack, mark my words. Next time, I doubt they'll be so polite.
Then we've got to move our whiskey to another hiding place, away from the house, Davy said. Safer for the whiskey, safer for Laurel. That would require careful planning, she said. First we have to find a place, and we can't do that tonight. Not with the county already a powder keg. And forget delivering to Ranger tonight. It would be too risky.
Don't worry about us, Davy said. We know to be on the lookout.
On the lookout for what?
Mike smacked his twin on the side of his head. You never could keep your friggin' mouth shut.
On the lookout for what?
Mike shot his brother a drop-dead look, then said to Laurel, "The other night, a truck loaded to the gills with whiskey was hijacked between here and Ranger. The poor bastard was dragged from his truck, blindfolded, manhandled into the woods, pushed to his knees, and told not to move or speak. He had a gun held to his head while all his whiskey was taken from his truck and put into the other vehicle. He never saw how many of them there were, but they made short work of it. When they were done, he thought he was dead for sure. But he was threatened with the removal of body parts a man holds dear if he was seen on that road again. He was ordered to spread the warning to anyone whose ambition was to get rich selling shine in the boomtowns. He was left there with a drained gas tank. But he lived to tell it."
Laurel said, "The Johnsons are hijacking now?"
Davy and Mike shared a look. Then Davy said softly, "He was a Johnson." "Lawmen don't terrorize," Mike said. "They would have identified themselves, confiscated the liquor, and placed him under arrest. Had to be a competitor who plans on taking over." Laurel lowered herself into a chair at the kitchen table. Hearing of this, on top of Thatcher's warnings this morning, and the visit from Croft and Landry this afternoon, left her rattled. She needed time to assimilate all this and plan her next course of action. But in the meantime, people for whom she was responsible were more vulnerable than she.
Lord, I hope our stills aren't cooking tonight. And you absolutely cannot make the trip to Ranger.
Mike said, "We're going."
I forbid it.
"Our contact up there is waiting and watching for us," Davy said. "He's not a patient man," Mike said. Davy added, "Neither are his thirsty customers." Laurel said,
"Tonight they can get their whiskey from someone else."
"One of Croft's deliverymen would be waiting for just such an opportunity to wedge in which case you'll be handing Croft exactly what he's after." Davy nodded in agreement with Mike. "That would be bad for our business."
"So is being hijacked," she said.
Mike placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're making the delivery as scheduled. Nothing to fret about. We've thought of a way to throw them off track." Davy winked. 52. Darkness had fallen by the time Thatcher returned to Barker's from Pointer's Gap. The auto garage was closed for the night. He needed to return Barker's borrowed rifle, but he was relieved that he wouldn't be delayed any longer than necessary. He stabled the Pinto and saw to it that he was well rewarded for his patience and endurance that afternoon. He stored the saddle and tack, went down the row of stalls to make sure that all the horses were content. Not all were.
He calmed the restless ones with soft talk and stroking, then secured the stable with his own sixth sense of uneasiness. Taking Barker's rifle with him, he walked across the bridge into town. Martin's Cafe was open, but there were few diners tonight. For the most part, downtown was closed and locked up, as though braced for a storm. With reason, one was brewing. Distant lightning brightened the sky just above the horizon. Every surface, whether natural or man-made, radiated the heat it had absorbed during the day. The air felt charged by something more ominous than low atmospheric pressure. Thatcher entered the boarding house and went upstairs unnoticed. By a stroke of luck, the third-floor bathroom was available. He made quick work of bathing and exchanging his dusty work clothes for his black suit. He buckled on his gun belt, pinned the deputy badge to the lapel of his coat, and took Barker's rifle with him. In and out of the boarding house in under 10 minutes, he set out on foot again. Only Bill's car was parked in front of the sheriff's department. Inside, he was alone, but on the telephone. Thatcher propped Barker's rifle against the wall beneath the gun rack, took off his fedora, and slumped tiredly in a chair. Bill completed his call with a "thank you very much" and hung the earpiece in its cradle.
"Dennis Kemp checks out,"
he said to Thatcher.
"Hasn't missed a day of work since he began the job. He was there yesterday.
Mrs. Kemp told you you'd be barking up the wrong tree." Thatcher looked toward the door that led into the cell block.
"How is he?" "Sullen when I took him his supper. The public defender hasn't made it in yet."
"Have you called him?"
"Considering all the arrests last night, I'm sure he had his hands full today with arraignment hearings. Driscoll can sulk till morning."
"How's Mrs. Amos doing?" The sheriff's forehead wrinkled with concern.
"Still ailing. If she's not better by tomorrow, I may take her to a doctor in Stephenville. Mrs. Cantor agreed to stay with her overnight if I can't get home."
"You're expecting more trouble?" He waved his hand to indicate the empty office.
"I've got every full-timer plus a dozen reserves like you patrolling in pairs. I want to keep a lid on things if we can. Vain hope, probably."
Thatcher drew his long legs in, leaned forward, and placed his elbows on his knees. "You've got plenty of trouble right in here, Bill." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a strip of cotton fabric roughly 6 inches in length and 3 inches wide. One side was flat, the other gathered. The weave was unraveling at both ends. The cloth had been weather-beaten, but under its coating of dust, the scarlet color was vibrant. Thatcher set the piece of cloth on the edge of the sheriff's desk. He spoke softly so not to be overheard by the man in the cell. "I went exploring this afternoon and found this. I recognized it right off. When I talked to Mrs. Driscoll, she was wearing an apron made out of material printed with red and yellow apples. It had a red ruffled border." Through the window, Thatcher saw a lightning bolt, closer this time, but it took the thunder a count of 7 to reach them. The storm was headed this way, but wasn't right on top of them yet. Bill seemed not to notice the weather. He was fixated on the fabric scrap.
"Where'd you find it?"
"Pointer's Gap, caught between some rocks, piled up, but not by God or Mother Nature. They'd been stacked."
"Pointer's Gap, where Gabe took his missus picnicking."
Thatcher scoffed. "The nearest I came to finding a picnic spot was a stream off the North Fork of the Biloxi, no deeper than a foot at its deepest. It had a ripple, but not what I'd call a current. A few scraggly trees along its banks. If he was trying to romance his wife with a picnic, a prettier spot would have been in his own shady backyard."
"When Bernie told us that Gabe had taken her there, I remember thinking that same thing."
"That stream is about a quarter mile from the Gap, and between them is wasteland. If he took her out there, it definitely wasn't a picnic."
Bill acknowledged that with a frown. "How'd you get out there?"
"Horseback."
"That's 6-8 miles each way."
"I'm used to it, or was," he said, wincing as he shifted in his chair. "I may be a bit saddle sore tomorrow." Both of them smiled, but they quickly became serious again. Bill asked,
"Did you disturb the pile of rocks?"
"No, just tugged that piece of cloth from between them. It ripped when I pulled, so there's more of it under there."
"Could you find the place again?"
"With no problem." Bill smoothed his hand over his mustache a few times.
"Gabe doesn't have a horse that I know of. How would he have gotten her out there?"
"There's a road, more like a trail, that comes in from the southwest on the other side of the hill. I figure he took care of Corinne at Lefty's."
"With Mrs. Driscoll dead in his car?"
Thatcher shrugged. "This is just my guess, Bill."
"Go on."
"When he finished up at Lefty's, he drove out, circled back to the gap on that lonely road, carried her body the rest of the way until he found a suitable spot. Maybe he stumbled upon a natural depression, maybe he dug one. But he buried her and stacked those rocks on top. It was dark, so he missed that." He pointed to the remnant of ruffle. "As hiding a body goes, he chose a good spot. If that cloth had been dull in color, I would have missed it."
"Good work, Thatcher."
"Knowing what you're likely to find under those rocks, it doesn't feel good. Not good at all." Bill waited a beat before continuing to theorize.
"On his way back into town, Gabe's conscience grabbed hold.
Or terror of being caught."
Either way, he realized the magnitude of what he'd done and headed to his mistress for solace. Then what, Thatcher? Did Miss Blanchard know he'd killed Mila or not? Did she calm him down and coach him on what to do next, what to say, and how to perform when questioned?
Mrs. Kemp doesn't think so.
She could be lying. She may know all too well that Norma was complicit.
Could be.
But you don't think so?
If Norma had lived, maybe her sister would have lied to cover for her. But why would she lie for her now?
To protect baby nephew Arthur from disgrace? Hell, I don't know.
Sighing, he covered his face with both hands and pressed his middle fingers into his eye sockets, his weariness evident.
I don't know anything anymore.
2 things you know, Thatcher said. Bill lowered his hands and looked across at him. 1. Norma Blanchard can't be held accountable even if she masterminded the murder. 2nd thing, you finally got a piece of evidence. It's not a decomposed body, but that apron trim might be enough to bring Driscoll to his knees.
He's proven to be mule-headed.
Won't hurt to try. Bill took the strip of cloth with him as he entered the cell block. Thatcher followed him to the last cell, where Driscoll was reclined on the cot, eyes closed, pale hands clasped over his stomach. Unless you have a defense lawyer with you, go away.
You'll want to see this, Gabe.
Thatcher and Bill waited him out, and his curiosity got the better of him. He opened his eyes and levered himself up on his elbows. Bill dangled the strip of red cloth.
Recognize this?
No.
Thatcher did.
Bill explained how Thatcher remembered seeing the ruffle on Mila's apron. Driscoll shrugged. She wore an apron every day of her life.
In the kitchen while baking shortbread, Bill said. Around the house as she was dusting the furniture. But why would she wear one to Pointer's Gap?
Mention of the landmark sparked a stunned reaction. His gaze darted to Thatcher, then back to Bill. What was he doing out there? Bill ignored the question.
He found this caught in a pile of rocks. What do you know about it, Gabe?
Nothing.
Explain to me how a ruffle off Mrs. Driscoll's apron got stuck between 2 rocks all the way out there in no man's land.
Why are you asking me? Why don't you ask him? He came off the cot and charged the cell bars, shoving his hand through 2 of them and grabbing Thatcher by his necktie. Do you really think he just wandered out there and accidentally found this? Where's your common sense, Sheriff? He knew where to find it because he buried Mila's body out there. It was him all along, don't you see? A crack of thunder startled them all. Driscoll actually let go of Thatcher's tie and fell back a step away from the bars, as though they'd suddenly been electrified. The first clap was followed by a second, then a third, and then a salvo. Simultaneously, Thatcher and Bill realized that it wasn't thunder. It was gunfire. 53. Chester Landry watched from the shadows as Laurel Plummer bade the O'Connor brothers goodbye. Even from this distance, he could tell she was anxious about sending them out tonight. She touched each of them on the arm and clung for a moment, like a mother reluctant to wave her children off to school for the first time. Final instructions were issued and goodbyes said, and the pair drove away in their truck. From the outside, it looked like a rattletrap held together with baling wire and crossed fingers. But as it drove past Landry, he was close enough to feel the vibration of the new engine the twins recently had installed. The swap-out had been done in a barn on a farm that had been foreclosed on years before. The mechanics, who'd helped themselves to the empty space, catered to moonshiners and bootleggers who were trying to outdo, or at least to equal, the horsepower had by lawmen, government agents, and each other. He wondered if Mrs. Plummer was aware of the new oomph under the battered hood of the O'Connors' truck. He would guess she wasn't. The O'Connors were too cocksure of themselves by far. Brimming with piss and vinegar, they took needless chances, seemed to thrive on excitation, and routinely flirted with calamity. But he couldn't fault them. He reveled in risk-taking. Lights were on inside, affording him a view through the window into the kitchen. He watched Mrs. Plummer drink a glass of tap water at the sink. Then she moved about the room nervously, picking up this or that, setting it down, opening a cabinet door only to close it without putting anything in or taking anything out. He saw her actually wring her hands. At one point, she lifted her pocketbook off a peg adjacent to the back door, as though she were about to leave, then changed her mind. She seemed troubled and restless, feeling compelled to do something, but unsure of what she should do. His timing was perfect. He emerged from the shadows and crossed the yard. The honeysuckle vine brushed his shoulder as he neared the back door. He knocked, but stood to one side, keeping himself concealed in the darkness until she appeared behind the screen. He stepped into the light and tipped his bowler hat to her. "Mrs. Plummer." Her lips tightened with dislike. "What are you doing here?" Her hand moved to her side, where she no doubt secreted a firearm in the pocket of her skirt. Probably a Derringer, a Hor's pistol. Small but lethal if fired at close range. "May I come in?" "No, you may not." "You sound adamant." "I am." "Why?" "It would be improper." Amused by her hypocritical stance on propriety, he said, "Improper because your father-in-law isn't at home? He's away this evening?" She realized that she'd trapped herself into admitting she was by herself, but rather than quail, she drew herself up taller. She looked above and beyond him at the lightning that streaked the sky. "It's about to storm," she said over the boom of thunder that rattled the windows of her house. "You wouldn't want to get wet, so leave now and don't come back. You and Mr. Croft were fishing in the wrong pond today. In any case, I said everything I had to say. Now if you'll—" "That's what I wanted to talk to you about, our visit today." He gave her a look of rehearsed chagrin. "You have every right to be miffed." "Don't talk down to me." He held up his hand in a pacifying gesture. "Mr. Croft often gets carried away. His strident manner is a character flaw which I've pointed out to him on numerous occasions, sadly to no avail. His overbearing approach to you was tactless and clumsy. He came on like a buffalo when a swan would have been more effective. It's little wonder to me that you turned him down." "Did he send you to make amends?" "No, I came entirely on my own." "I don't want your apology. I want you to leave." "But I didn't come to apologize." "To do what then? Ask me to reconsider your deal?" "No," he said smoothly. "I came to offer you a better one." His statement startled her, but not as much as the gunshot that punctuated it. Numerous blasts followed, the rapid popping sounding like the finale of a fireworks display. Even before the barrage stopped, Laurel stunned him by shoving open the screen door. She shouldered him out of her way and began running in the direction from which the shots had come. Landry went after her, shouting her name. She didn't even slow down. Bill locked the door between the office and the cell block while Thatcher retrieved Barker's rifle and took another from the rack for Bill. Moving swiftly and without a single word being spoken between them, they exited the building and got into Bill's car. While Thatcher loaded and checked the weapons, the sheriff drove at top speed through downtown. Main Street was already filling up with curiosity seekers streaming in the direction of the apparent shootout. Thatcher noticed that one man in the crowd still had his napkin from the cafe tucked into his collar. Bill shouted at the onlookers and angrily waved them out of his way. He used his horn to bleat out warnings for them to move aside or get bowled over. Bill gave the car more gas as it trundled across the bridge. On the far side of it, they rounded a bend to find the road blocked by a disabled truck. Both doors stood open. The radiator was spewing steam like a tea kettle. The truck had been riddled by bullets. The driver had made it out. He lay sprawled in the road. The passenger was still in his seat.
Jesus!
Bill used the handbrake to bring his car to a skidding stop. Thatcher, noticing movement in the underbrush to his right, was out of the car before inertia rocked it to rest. He leaped across the ditch in pursuit. The woods were as dark as midnight. Bursts of lightning only served to momentarily blind him. But the brilliant flashes, followed by complete darkness, were reminiscent of nighttime battles, and he'd had plenty of experience with those. Conditioned reflexes took over. Rifle up, he ran on, dodging trees, ducking low branches, doing his best to avoid pitfalls in the undergrowth. Ahead of him, men were shouting to each other. The words were indistinct, but their connotation was urgency. If they kept up the racket, they'd lead Thatcher straight to them. But then he heard the sound of an automotor sputtering to life. Fuck! He pushed himself harder, but by the time he reached the road, all he saw of the retreating car was the wink of its taillights as it disappeared around a curve. Any attempt to run it down on foot would be futile. He didn't even break stride as he reversed direction and ran back toward the site of an evident ambush. He cleared the woods and jumped the ditch again, then paused to catch his breath and take in the scene. The crowd of onlookers had increased in number. 2 more sheriff's department vehicles were parked on either side of Bill's car. Deputies had divided up. A few were grouped around the man lying face up on the pavement. Others had formed a semicircle in the open passenger door. Harold and another deputy Thatcher didn't know had the tailgate down and were shining flashlights into the back of the truck. Thatcher lowered the rifle and made his way over to Bill, who was kneeling at the side of the man lying in the road. It was one of the O'Connor twins, although Thatcher couldn't have said which. He was bleeding from several wounds, but his lips were moving, and Bill was listening intently.
His brother's dead.
Thatcher turned. Harold elaborated without being asked to.
The twins came around the bend there, caught fire from the trees on both sides of the road. They didn't stand a chance. Somebody wanted to make a point. Whoever it was came through the woods from the road that parallels this one.
Thatcher pointed.
I chased them, but they had too good of a head start. Didn't see how many, but all of them fit into one vehicle.
Harold nodded, then said,
Hell of it is, if this had to do with the illegal liquor trade, they got the wrong guys. All they were hauling was a bunch of pies and jars of fruit fillings.
Get away from me!
The voice was shrill, but Thatcher recognized it instantly and spun around. Laurel was struggling to escape the grasping hands of Chester Landry. Thatcher was in motion before he even thought about it. He swung the rifle barrel to waist level and ran toward them, shouting, "Let her go!" Laurel managed to wrestle herself free, But Landry reached for her again, catching hold of the back of her skirt and bringing her up short. She whirled around and slugged him in the face with her fist.
"Landry!" Thatcher yelled. "Let go of her!"
Seeing Thatcher bearing down on him and recognizing the hellfire he represented, Landry immediately released Laurel and ran for his life, disappearing into the woods on the other side of the road. Over his shoulder, Thatcher hollered to Harold, "Go after him!" The deputy took off running. Thatcher ran to close the remaining distance between him and Laurel, but she was on an undeterred path toward the truck, and she was in a crazed state. Thatcher overcame her and grabbed hold of her arm with his free hand. She turned her head and looked up at him, wild-eyed and frantic.
"That's the twins' truck. I heard the shooting."
She jerked free of his hold and continued on. Thatcher called her name, and when he caught her again, they engaged in a tussle not unlike the one she'd been in with Landry.
"Laurel, stop it! Laurel!"
He finally got her to stand still.
"One is wounded but alive. The other is gone."
It took several seconds for the message to sink in, then she threw back her head and wailed.
No!
He tried to draw her to him, but she took in the badge, the gun belt around his hips, the rifle he still carried. When it all registered, she threw off his hands to free herself.
Damn you!
She yelled as she ran backward.
Stay away from me!
Realizing the conclusion she'd drawn, he said, "No, Laurel, it wasn't me. Wasn't us. This was..." But he was talking to the empty space where she'd been standing. She knocked onlookers aside as she plowed through them to get to where Bill still knelt beside the wounded man. She gave another wail when she saw him and dropped to her knees. Harold huffed up to Thatcher.
He was too fast. I lost him in the dark.
With cold determination, Thatcher said, "Don't worry, I'll find him." Hiram Johnson sat in a filthy, upholstered armchair with his bare, bloated right foot propped on a stool. An open jar of moonshine was on the windowsill, along with a fly swatter, both within easy reach. A Bible lay open on his lap. Mayor Bernard Croft had never seen such a disgusting sight in his life, and doubted he ever would. The old man's rotting foot stank to high heaven. It was as though the walls of this house seeped the rancid odor of generations of Johnsons. The unmoving air smelled of dirty hair, dirty feet, decayed teeth, tobacco-laced expectorant, and baby shit. The foulness of it all sickened Bernie. He could barely keep his dinner down. Of course, he'd known more or less what he was letting himself in for when he'd requested this meeting. He'd sent Hennessy to parley with Hiram, requesting an assemblage of the clans so that Bernie could address them collectively. Hennessy had been instructed to stress that Bernie would be assuming all the risks because the meeting would take place on Hiram's turf. Bernie would be walking into the lion's den, but the goal was to end the strife between his faction and the Johnsons. Give and take, negotiation, compromise, a fair division of territories. The goal being to end this silly and counterproductive war. They had congregated. The house was overflowing with representatives of the myriad branches of the family. They had listened to Bernie's impassioned speech. It was time to make his final pitch and close the deal. He stood before Hiram. "This feud would eventually play itself out, Mr. Johnson. You've lived long enough, been a businessman long enough to know that ultimately things work out and life returns to the way it was before. But in the meantime, this destructive bickering costs us both revenue. People get hurt, people die. It's a waste. If we stop fighting each other, we can devote ourselves to fighting our common enemy, which is this new goddamn federal law." He ended on a high note that elicited guffaws from many. Not, however, from the old man, who spat into his coffee can.
"You can have Ranger," Hiram said, "but I want Breckenridge and any other boom towns that spring up between here and the Red River. You can have anything south of here."
There won't be any boomtowns south of here because there's no oil south of here. Not for hundreds of miles, as you well know.
West, then,
Hiram said.
Show 'em the map.
A man in greasy overalls stepped forward and passed Bernie a faded map. He studied the lines that had been drawn on it to demarcate territories.
This is attractive to me. They're already drilling out there west of Abilene, around Odessa.
So more than fair, I think. Take it or leave it.
He spat again.
If I take it, it amounts to a ceasefire. Agreed?
Agreed.
And it goes into effect immediately?
Hiram nodded.
Splendid.
Bernie stepped forward, right hand extended. With an evil gleam in his eye, the rotting son of a bitch wiped tobacco spittle off his lip before clutching Bernie's hand. Despite his revulsion, Bernie gave him an enthusiastic handshake.
I was so optimistic about the outcome of this meeting that I brought you a gift, Mr. Johnson.
He signaled Hennessy, who'd been waiting out on the porch.
I've brought you a case of Kentucky bourbon, direct from my most trusted bootlegger in Dallas and Fort Worth.
Oohs and ahs of appreciation rippled through the compacted gathering of bodies as the case was carried in and set on the floor in front of that putrid foot.
Enjoy.
Bernie's leave-taking was unceremonious. It was barely even noticed. Hiram was already swilling from a bottle of the whiskey. His relatives were greedily converging around the case. Together, Bernie and Hennessy walked toward the town car. Looking back over his shoulder at the party underway, Hennessy asked,
How long before the poison works? I've decided it takes too long. Did you bring along some of your toys?
Always, boss.
Bernie grinned as he climbed into the driver's seat.
Give me 10 minutes to get to the highway, then light her up.
54. Bernie entered his house through the front door and automatically locked it behind him. He had driven himself from Hiram's house to the intersection with the highway, where he'd gotten to enjoy the fireball. When Hennessy caught up with him, the Irishman had taken his traditional place in the driver's seat while Bernie got into the back and savored his success during the trip into town. The Johnsons, not blown to smithereens in the blast, would have been cooked to well done in the fire. Both he and Hennessy were confident that they hadn't been followed. Hennessy had waited to be certain that Bernie made it safely inside his front door, then struck out on foot. He lodged in a seedier part of town. He didn't fear that on his walk home anyone would be fool enough to accost him. Through the side window on the front door, Bernie checked the street one last time. It was empty. Nothing moving save for Hennessy disappearing into the downpour. Tomorrow, when Mayor Croft was told the shocking news of the conflagration, he would publicly attribute it to a lightning strike. The old Johnson place would have been a tinderbox, he would say. The poor souls inside, a great number of the legendary clan, including the patriarch, had stood little chance of escaping the flames. For the town's bi-weekly gazette, he would wax poetic about the tragedy. He would milk it for all it was worth. But now, as he collapsed his umbrella and hung his hat on the coat tree, he wanted to cackle with delight over his triumph. He stepped into the parlor and reached for the light switch. Leave it. Bernie fell back against the door jamb and clapped his hand over his heart.
Jesus, Chester.
Why, Mr. Mayor, you jumped like someone with a guilty conscience. The darkness was relieved only by light from a street lamp shining through the front window curtains. Bernie's eyes adjusted. Landry was sitting with his typical indolence in an easy chair, legs crossed. He said, "Where have you and Hennessy been off to tonight?" Bernie went over to a cabinet and took out a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses.
A better question would be, what are you doing inside my house at this hour, sitting in the dark?
He poured an inch of bourbon into each glass and carried one over to Landry. "Thank you." He clinked his glass against Bernie's, but didn't drink from it. Bernie settled himself on the divan facing Landry's chair.
Well,
Landry propped his drinking glass on his knee and stared into it for a moment.
My welcome in your little burg has worn thin, Bernie.
You're leaving?
Tonight.
Bernie's eyebrows shot up.
Tonight?
How long do you plan to be away?
Forever. I'm severing our partnership, as of now.
This was an unexpected turn, but not at all disappointing to Bernie. Landry's welcome had been wearing thin with him, too. Initially, he'd needed a man like Landry to grease the skids into the bootlegging trade. But Bernie's own contacts in the cities were well established by now. The value of Landry's usefulness had decreased. It certainly wasn't worth the percentage he demanded. If Landry wanted out, Bernie wasn't at all sorry to bid him farewell. Nevertheless, he attempted to look bemused.
Why? Bad business practices.
Whose?
Yours.
It was an effort for Bernie to conceal his outrage.
I don't ask for or require the approval of a slick dandy like you, but I am curious. Can you give me an example of the business practices you oppose?
Gladly. For example, with a little courting, a little finessing, Laurel Plummer might have been won over. Instead, you bullied her. That tactic didn't flatter you. It didn't cast a favorable light on me either, which I resent. It also failed colossally.
She'll come around.
Oh, I seriously doubt that. Not after you had her errand boys ambushed and shot all to hell. Bernie snickered.
How did the duo fare? Did they survive?
I don't know. I was spotted near the scene. Although I'm not proud to admit it, I ran. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, the only sign of his simmering anger. You took that action upon yourself, Bernie. You executed that ambush without consulting me.
Because you would have wavered when action was called for.
I would have acted with more discretion, as I did with Randy. The problem was solved, but it was neat. Nobody's curiosity was aroused.
We needed to make a splash,
Bernie said.
We needed to do something that would get the lovely widow's attention.
Well, you succeeded at that, but this bloody display will also draw the attention of people who aren't so lovely. Bad for business, Bernie. Bad for business. Because now you're going to be in the bullseye of a crackdown, beginning with a thorough investigation by local law.
I've made Bill Amos a eunuch, and his department is a joke.
His newly appointed deputy isn't what I'd call a jolly sort.
Hutton, I'm not scared of him.
Another example of your foolishness.
How dare!
If Hutton doesn't give you pause, the Texas Rangers are even less jocular than he is. The governor is a colorful character, granted, but he's been known to send in troops to help curtail a lucrative bootleg trade. When they all come gunning for the ringleader in this area of the state, I want to be far removed from you. He set his glass on a small table at his elbow, then stood. I let myself in through the back door. I'll go out the same way. Bernie came to his feet.
You smug prick. Do you expect me to believe that you're just walking away, leaving money on the table, retiring?
Landry stopped and turned back. Did I say that? He flashed the sly grin that Bernie had come to detest. I've never met a woman who didn't love shoes, and there are women everywhere who have men in their lives who enjoy a drink. The grin widened to reveal his gold tooth. I won't have any trouble drumming up business. Then he whispered, "Watch your back, Bernie." Thatcher didn't see Chester Landry's car among those parked at the boarding house. But he didn't let that stop him from taking the front steps 2 at a time. The house was dark, except for a few dim lights, providing barely enough illumination for him to see his way up the staircase. He knew Landry occupied room number 4 on the 2nd floor. He knocked. Silence. He knocked again and put his ear to the door. He heard nothing. Across the hall, a door opened and a head popped out. He recognized the boarder, but didn't recall his name. He said, "He's not there. He left this afternoon."
Did he say where he was going?
Nope. Just cleared out his stuff.
Cleared out? You mean he moved out?
Lock, stock, and barrel. Took all his shoe samples. Seemed to be on short notice.
Thatcher twisted the doorknob, but it was locked. He jerked on it harder. When it didn't give, he backed up a few steps.
I don't believe Mrs. May would approve.
Thatcher kicked in the door. The room was empty. The bed had already been stripped of sheets. Replacement bedding and a bath towel were folded and stacked, awaiting the next boarder. Thatcher searched every drawer in the bureau, opened the closet, checked under the bed. He flipped back the mattress, but there was nothing beneath it except rusty bed springs.
What the hell do you think you're doing?
The landlady was standing in the open doorway, hands on her hips. She looked like a hag during daytime. The nighttime variant was worse. Nevertheless, Thatcher moved in on her.
Did Landry say where he was going?
No, and I didn't ask, she said. Ain't my business, is it?
He's moved out for good? He's not coming back?
Not your business, neither.
Thatcher tapped the badge on his lapel.
Sheriff Amos will disagree. Should I send him over to talk to you?
She folded her housecoat closer around her and jutted out her pointy chin.
He said he was taking over a new sales territory and wouldn't be back. Paid me for a few extra days because he'd failed to give me notice. Packed up his automobile and headed out. That's all I know.
What time did he leave?
I can't. What time? 4:30, thereabouts. He interrupted me while I was busy setting up the sideboard.
She sniffed.
Which I didn't appreciate one bit.
Thatcher stepped back into the hallway and addressed all the boarders, who now were watching curiously from their open doorways, as they had the night he'd been taken into custody. Some shrank back.
Anybody know where Chester Landry was going? Did he ever say where he was from?
All I ever heard was Dallas, one said. That was followed with murmurs of agreement.
He ever mentioned family?
No one answered, but one asked,
"What'd he do?"
Thatcher said,
"If anyone hears anything from him or about him, come get me. Sorry to have woken you up."
He jogged down the stairs and out the front door. 5 minutes later, he stood dripping rainwater in the waiting room of Dr. Perkins's clinic, explaining to Bill what he'd learned.
Landry had prepared to run even before the ambush.
Leading you to believe he may have been instrumental in that?
He might have planned it, but he didn't participate.
In unison, Thatcher and the sheriff turned toward Laurel, who'd spoken from the chair that Patsy Kemp had occupied days before. Laurel looked small and defenseless, with shoulders hunched, hugging her elbows. She said,
"He was at my back door when the shooting started."
Bill walked over to her. "What was Chester Landry doing at your back door?" She was about to answer when Dr. Perkins came out of the interior room. His lab coat was bloodied. Laurel shot to her feet. He didn't keep them in suspense.
"My nurse and I successfully removed 2 bullets. The third went through his lower left abdomen. I've done what I can. He's still with us."
"Is he out of danger?" Laurel asked.
"No, Mrs. Plummer. He survived the surgery, but he's not in the clear."
Seeing her distress, he said,
"But he's young and strong. His vitals are good. If he can stave off infection, he has a good chance of recovery. Men with far worse wounds have recovered."
Laurel covered her mouth and took a deep breath.
"Does he know about Davy?"
"He demanded that I tell him," Bill said to her. "It was just before he lost consciousness, so it may not have sunk in."
"It did,"
Dr. Perkins said, looking bleak.
"He came to and was most fretful over it before we sedated him."
Laurel gave a soft sob.
"Can I see him?"
Dr. Perkins looked her over. Her dress, shoes, and stockings were spattered with mud and streaked with Mike's blood.
"He's still out cold, Mrs. Plummer. He won't know you're there, and infection is a major concern. Tomorrow would be better."
Only then did she seem to realize how bedraggled she looked and the reason for the doctor's hesitancy to let her near his patient.
But she stood proud and composed. "I'll be here first thing in the morning. I need to get back." Dr. Perkins retreated and shut the door. The three of them filed out of the waiting area, Laurel leading the way. Bill and Thatcher had conferred briefly at the scene of the ambush before Thatcher had gone in search of Landry. At the time, the sheriff had dispatched men to comb the woods on both sides of the road in search of clues. They recovered dozens of shell casings from numerous weapons, but nothing else. Bill had remarked then that he hoped the rain would hold off until daylight tomorrow, when a more thorough search could be made of the woods and the road on which the getaway car had sped away. Thatcher could tell how disheartened Bill was when they reached the exit of the office building to see that the lightning and thunder had moved east, but a hard rain was being driven sideways by a strong wind.
"So much for tire tracks and footprints,"
Bill said, as he motioned Laurel and Thatcher toward his car. They dashed through the rain and piled in. When they reached Laurel's house, it was in total darkness. "Thank you for the ride." She opened the backseat door herself, got out, and ran toward the house. Thatcher watched her go inside, then turned his head and looked at Bill. Bill gave him a knowing smile.
"Busy day in store for tomorrow. Gabe Driscoll, now this ambush with one man dead. You're only a reserve, Thatcher. I've got no claim on you, but I'd sure appreciate your help."
"I'll stop by the stable and see if Fred can spare Roger to tend to the horses tomorrow."
"Early then."
Thatcher nodded, got out, and ran through the torrent to Laurel's door. 55. The electricity was out in Laurel's house. When Thatcher entered the kitchen through the back door, she was lighting a kerosene lamp. She blew out the match and situated the glass chimney. She said, "You know what's funny?" He propped Barker's rifle against the wall and hung his dripping hat on the wall peg. "I can't think of a thing." Davy would have been the first to laugh over being killed for a truckload of pies and fruit fillings. It was his and Mike's idea. They cooked it up even before I told them about Mayor Croft and Chester Landry visiting today.
Hold on. The mayor and Landry came here?
To try to coerce me into joining their, I don't know the word, syndicate? Did you know the mayor is a bootlegger? Anyway, they showed up at my front door this afternoon. In a thready voice, she pieced together broken sentences to relate what the pair had proposed. Thatcher wasn't surprised by any of it, except for Bernie Croft's brashness. "Who did the talking?" he asked. "The mayor." Up till now, Croft had used his political office as cover. If he was stepping out from behind it, he must be feeling damned confident that he couldn't be touched. That was a troubling prospect. "When they left," Laurel was saying, "I had the shakes. I knew I hadn't seen the last of them, but I didn't think their reprisal would come this soon or be so deadly." Tears filled her eyes. "When I told the twins about that visit and the reason behind it, they admitted that a truck had been hijacked just a few days ago." She described the incident to Thatcher. "I suppose the only reason they let that Johnson man live was so he could put his family and the rest of us on notice. Nevertheless, the twins were keen on going tonight." "But without whiskey?" She nodded. "They weren't selling just my whiskey. They had been dealing with another moonshiner who's up closer to Ranger. They'd bought several crates from him and had hidden them someplace accessible, so the product would be on hand when they needed it. In view of this recent hijacking, they had counted on selling what was in that stockpile, but would continue to make the trip from here to there with pies only. In the event they were intercepted, the joke would be on whoever had stopped them. Their thinking was that after they were caught with only pies as cargo, they would be left alone. You see, isn't that just like a prank the two of them would pull?" She gave a dry, forced laugh, and she began to quiver like a shell-shocked trooper on the verge of cracking. He spoke her name quietly, and when she blinked him into focus, he asked about Landry. "Tell me what happened with him." He must have been watching the house because he came to the back door almost immediately after the twins left. He said Mayor Croft had been overbearing and tactless, and that he didn't blame me for turning them down. He said he had come not at Croft's behest, but on his own to make me a better offer. I don't know what he was going to propose, because that's when the shooting started. The instant I heard the gunfire, I had a premonition, a sick feeling.
She touched her stomach.
I took off running. Landry came after me and caught up. From there, you saw.
The coward ran and got away.
Mike was lying in the street, and Davy was dead. They made such easy targets as they came out of the curve in the road.
She appeared to want to say more, but her throat seized up. She had difficulty swallowing. Laurel, it wasn't lawmen who ambushed them. She looked down at the floor, but he didn't think it registered with her that the puddle around her muddy shoes had been formed by her dripping clothes.
Sheriff Amos called it sabotage, she said. Moonshiners, mistaking the twins for rivals. And they were. They were. For me.
She pressed her fist to her chest.
I let them go tonight, knowing the danger.
She covered her face with her hands and began to sob.
Herf kept telling me it wasn't a lark. You warned me. But no. I was conceited and stubborn and thought that I was above the fray, that I couldn't be touched. And because of that vanity, Davy died.
Sensing that she was about to collapse where she stood, Thatcher crossed over to her and enfolded her in his arms. The O'Connors knew they were playing a dangerous game. They knew the risks.
But it's my fault.
No, Laurel. They loved the thrill. With or without you, they would have become part of this trade.
I tried my best to talk them out of going tonight. Honestly, Thatcher, I did. But they were bent on it. If Mike lives, he will never get over losing his brother. Never.
Her forehead dropped against his sternum, and she began to sob harder.
I can't do this anymore. Even if I wanted to continue, I can't. I can't risk another life.
You gotta stop risking your own. He scooped her up into his arms and headed for the staircase. Feebly, she pushed against his chest.
Let me down.
You're sopping wet. Your teeth are chattering and you're about to drop. He carried her into her bedroom, set her on her feet, and propped her against the wall. He went around the room, pulling down the window shades, and lit the lamp on her dresser, keeping the flame low. He folded back the bedcovers. She hadn't moved from where he'd left her. For the longest time, they stood facing, staring into each other's eyes. You're fragile right now, he said. I promised I would never take advantage of you, and I meant it. I'm putting you to bed. If you don't want me in there with you, say so now. She didn't move or speak. Keeping his eyes locked with hers, he reached down and untied the thong holding his holster against his thigh, then unbuckled the gun belt and set it in a chair. His coat was wet. It clung, but he worked himself out of it. He flipped his braces off his shoulders, opened several buttons of his shirt, then impatiently pulled it over his head. Shoes and socks went next. He unbuttoned his fly, but stopped there. He knelt in front of her and slipped off her shoes. Sliding his hands up her legs under her skirt, he found her garters, rolled down her stockings, and peeled them off her chilled feet. When he stood up, he reached behind her head, pulled out what few pins remained in her hair, and dropped them to the floor. As her hair tumbled down her back, he combed his fingers through it.
Thatcher,
With abject misery, he moaned, Please don't shy from me, Laurel.
I'm not, it's just...
In a purely feminine, self-conscious gesture, she touched the tear tracks on her cheeks, then moved her hand down to her collar, which she drew closed over her throat.
I'm not very tidy.
His heart thumped with restored anticipation. Her voice was husky from weeping, and so seductive he wanted to trap it inside her mouth and taste it.
I don't need you tidy. I need you now.
He placed his hands flat against the wall on either side of her head, lowered his, and used his nose to nudge open the collar she'd closed. He pressed an open-mouth kiss on the side of her neck, nibbled up the slender column of it to her ear, where he breathed, "I won't hold back."
"Please don't. Make me forget."
"What?"
"Everything."
That sighed consent unleashed a primal urge in him to claim, possess, mate. He came up against her and covered her face with kisses, then slanted his mouth over hers. He ate from it, unable to draw as much from it as he was yearning for, greedy for. He went back and back and back for more. He slid his hands from the wall to her breasts. There was no corset to prevent him from massaging and reshaping them. She leaned into the caresses in unshy offering. Somehow he managed to keep their mouths fused as he pulled her blouse free of her waistband and unbuttoned it. The buttons were small and round, and devils to work free of the wet material. At last he got them undone, and her blouse was off. He skimmed his hands over her front, feeling the warmth of her skin through her chemise. He compressed the tips of her breasts between his fingers and heard her breath flutter around his name as she sighed it. After 2 failed attempts, he found the fastening of her skirt and undid it. The skirt, weighted with rainwater, crumpled to the floor. Laurel stepped out of it, leaving her in only her chemise and underpants. He took her hands and tugged her forward as he backed up to the bed and sat down on the side of it, then wrapped her in his arms and pressed his face into the giving softness of her middle. Hands splayed over her back, he held her there and breathed her in. Then he drew her down onto the bed, turned her to lie on her back, and following her down, half covered her body as he kissed her. She clasped his head, digging her fingers into his hair. His hands moved over her, charting the dips and swells of her body until he reached the hem of her chemise. He bunched it to her waist, pulled it up over her breasts, and pulled it over her head. She lifted her hair free of it, tossed it over the side of the bed, and lay back, drawing him back down to her. He kissed her breasts, suckled them in turn as he stroked the plane of her stomach with the backs of his fingers, moving a little lower with each brush of skin over skin until he encountered the row of tiny buttons on her underpants. He toyed with them, plucked at them, then popped them free. He worked the garment over her hips, down her thighs, past her knees, and off. The hair in the V of her thighs was soft against his palm as he cupped her. Sliding his fingers deeper, he dipped into her and caressed, then rolled onto his hip, opened his fly, and made the head of his cock slick with the moisture his fingertips had collected. He levered himself above her. Her thighs hugged his hips. His first probe found her tight but yielding. He pressed inside, barely breaching but snugly securing himself in silky heat. He forced himself to hold there. But Laurel was looking up at him with lambent eyes, puffing soft and rapid breaths through her lips. Her fingers linked behind his neck. So he rocked into her incrementally, inch by intoxicating inch, until he was gloved by her. His breath soughed loudly in the otherwise silent room. He bracketed her upper body with his forearms, leaving his hands free to touch her eyebrows, cheeks, lips. He kissed her gently. At least it started out that way, but her tongue tangled with his, and he resumed the hungry kisses of before. She angled herself up against him, rubbing belly to belly, restlessly grazing her nipples against his chest. Her hands coasted down his spine to the small of his back, then into his loose trousers and onto his butt. For hands so small, they squeezed him with surprising strength, insistent on pulling him closer, deeper. She heard the primal growl that came from his own throat as he began to move. Slow, penetrating glides, near withdrawals before sinking deep, deeper. shallow, rapid strokes that appealed to his carnal instinct to come now. He didn't, but he tilted his hips just enough to change the point of friction to enable a prolonged grind against that elusive little bead that he had acquainted her with. Her first climax had alarmed her. She had resisted and rejected it. Now she was arching up in want of another. He'd had wet dreams about just this, about Laurel's desperate reaching for the abandon he could give her. His control slipping, he groaned her name in a plea, a prayer. Her breath turned choppy, then stopped altogether as her body bowed and went taut. She gave a soft, startled cry, then began milking him with such perfection he almost waited too late to pull out. Really not since Derby had come home from Europe had Laurel felt completely at rest. This must be the way it felt when a beguiling narcotic channeled through one's veins, replacing distress, anger, grief, all things horrid with a honeyed peace. The languor was lovely. She had no wish to move. Not until Thatcher did. And then she opened her eyes to watch as he walked over to the dresser and took off his pants. His tall frame was spared lankiness by wide shoulders, defined muscles and tendons, and a perfectly formed, firm backside. "You mind me getting naked?" She sought his eyes in the mirror above the dresser, from which he'd obviously been watching her watch him. A worry line appeared between his eyebrows. "Are you embarrassed now by what we did?" "No, only embarrassed that you caught me admiring the view." The line faded, and he grinned as he poured water onto a cloth and washed himself, then filled the bowl from the pitcher, got a fresh cloth off the towel rack, wet it, and brought it back to the bed. She couldn't keep herself from admiring the front view, too. He was generously apportioned. He sat down on the side of the bed and washed her stomach with the cloth, then passed it to her. Reaching beneath the sheet, she cleaned herself between her thighs. "I'll get some sheiks," he said. "But except for the flu, I didn't catch anything over there." Derby had explained to her why servicemen had been encouraged to use prophylactics. He'd assured her that he had. Thatcher got back in the bed and stretched out beside her on his side, his elbow on the mattress, his fist supporting his cheek. He pulled back the sheet that she had draped over her hips and surveyed her with frank interest. His absorbed gaze made her turn rosier than she already was. "You are embarrassed," he said. "Bashful." She lowered her eyes and addressed his chin. "I've only been with Derby. I don't know how to act with you." "Don't act at all. Just be you." "Can I tell you something?" "Something good, I hope." "An admission." She reached out and placed her hand on the meaty part of his chest. Her fingers lightly stroked the dusting of hair. "I wanted to see you without your undershirt." "What?" "The night you brought Irv home. You'd used your shirt to stanch the wound and were wearing..."